The US Attorney General fired the FBI's deputy director on Friday. There are now fears President Donald Trump might try to sack Special Counsel Robert Mueller. So what does all this mean for the Russia investigation? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Lara. Almost a year ago, President Donald Trump fired the director of the FBI, James Comey, a controversial move that set in motion developments that continue to reverberate across Washington. Now, Friday's dismissal of the man who was Comey's deputy, Andrew McCabe, is raising further questions. Attorney General Jeff Sessions accused him of misconduct and a lack of candour. Trump called it a great day for democracy. But McCabe says his firing is part of Donald Trump's continuing war on the FBI. He also revealed that he'd kept notes about his meetings with Trump. Those memos have now been given to Special Counsel Robert Mueller, who's looking into possible Russian meddling in the 2016 election. Trump has called them fake memos and is now calling on the Mueller investigation to be shut down. But some Republicans, along with many Democrats, have warned Trump not to dismiss Mueller. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham says if he does fire Mueller, it could be the beginning of the end of Trump's presidency. Well, we'll be getting to our guests in just a moment, but first this report from Patty Culhane in Washington.
If Twitter is any indication, U.S. President Donald Trump is growing increasingly worried about the investigation into ties between his campaign and Russia, sending off a series of angry tweets, including this one, where he did something he normally doesn't do. He mentions Robert Mueller by name, tweeting, "Why does the Mueller team have 13 hardened Democrats, some big crooked Hillary supporters, and 0 Republicans?" Another Dem recently added, "Does anyone think this is fair?" And yet, there is no collusion. There are a couple of problems with this tweet. First of all, Mueller is a Republican. So is the man in charge of him, Rod Rosenstein, who Trump appointed. And the FBI director, Christopher Wray, also a Republican. Trump also tweeted there was no crime, but 3 people who were part of his campaign, 2 rather high up, have pled guilty to committing crimes. More than 20 people and companies have been indicted so far. On Saturday, Trump's personal lawyer, John Dowd, called for a shutdown of Mueller's investigation, at first saying he was speaking for the president, but later backtracking, leading to criticism from Democrats and Republicans.
This would undoubtedly result in a constitutional crisis, and I think Democrats and Republicans need to speak out about this right now.
Give him the time, the resources, the independence to do his job. And when you are innocent, if the allegation is collusion with the Russians and there is no evidence of that and you're innocent of that, act like it.
Trump can't actually fire Mueller, but he could try to fire the people in charge of him, asking their replacements to kill the probe. That would likely lead to huge protests and pressure on Congress to name Mueller a special prosecutor, giving him vastly more power that couldn't be stopped, no matter what the president wants. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Okay, let's bring in our guests now. And in Washington, D.C., we have Lara Brown, Director and Associate Professor at the Graduate School of Political Management at George Washington University. In Lubbock, Texas, via Skype, Oliver McGee, former Deputy Assistant Transport Secretary. And also in Washington, Bruce Fein, former Associate Deputy Attorney General. A very warm welcome to all of you. Oliver, let's cut straight to the chase here. Why has the FBI's former Deputy Director Andrew McCabe been fired?
Well, basically, this was about the Inspector General's report and the Office of Professional Responsibility. When McCabe was in charge of the Clinton investigation and also investigation of the emails and the foundation, this is all about being forthright to the FBI questioning. This is about transparency and disclosure while you're in charge of the investigation. And the FBI internal review found there were problems with that. And so they made recommendations to the Attorney General, and he acted. Usually when a cabinet when a cabinet secretary gets a report from the Inspector General, they usually follow that report.
Okay, so what do you make then of all these suspicions that it was a political move? And we've got Trump criticising McCabe for months beforehand, celebrating it over the weekend as a great day for democracy. You can see where those suspicions come from.
Well, I think that it's not necessarily a celebration by the president. He's just merely responding to what the American people are saying. 75% of the American people are now saying that they want this probe to end. It's been a year long. We've delved into quite a bit of information, quite a bit of money has been spent, and largely there has been no collusion, and there is really no obstruction of justice. And obstruction of justice requires that there is a crime or misdemeanor first before you can then begin to obstruct justice. The president has a right of his appointment powers, along with powers of signature and to persuade, to pick the people that he wants to serve in his administration. Firing Comey was well within the purview of the president, and then you cannot then turn this into a giant prosecution probe, and as he calls a witch hunt, just because you've decided to make a big personnel change.
Okay.
Also,
let's just stop there for a moment, because I do want to get more broadly into the wider investigation later. Just for the moment, let's just stick with McCabe. Lara, what do you make of his sacking and it coming just 2 days before his retirement? I mean, that seems awfully unfair.
Well, I think what it appears to be is vindictive. While there may have been some questions about how Andrew McCabe handled his authority with regard to press releases and revealing information about the investigations to the media, which was the original sort of inappropriate handling of evidence and facts, that it seems wildly incongruous and much sort of out of line with what happened versus what his record was versus what his punishment was. And I do think what you see is an FBI that is under assault by this administration, that is being attacked at every level, and I think unfairly. They are pursuing investigations that we know actually are important. It was the decision by many intelligence entities that the Russians did meddle in the 2016 election. And what we're really trying to understand is the extent of that operation. How much were operatives at the campaign level involved in that effort?
Okay. Bruce, what do you make of that? I mean, there's a suggestion that McCabe has memos of conversations with Trump that might be revelatory. One wonders what those revelations might be.
Well, we could extrapolate from what Mr. Comey has said. For example, he has testified that Mr. Trump asked him to back away from the investigation of Mr. Flynn, who ultimately pleaded guilty to a felony. But I want to correct, I think, a couple of probably inadvertent misstatements that were meant earlier. One, you do not need proof of an actual crime to be guilty of obstruction of justice. In fact, you can be guilty of the crime even if it's a congressional rather than an executive branch investigation. Obstruction of justice is attempting to prevent a full investigation of a potential crime, not one that's already been perpetrated. Secondly, whether or not Mr. Trump could fire Mr. Comey, Mr. Mueller directly is problematic. When President Nixon did that to Archibald Cox, the court held it was illegal because you've got to change the regulations first. Moreover, the firing of Mr. Cox was used as evidence of corruption of justice in the articles of impeachment voted by the House Judiciary Committee and ultimately voted by the House of Representatives before President Nixon resigned. So even if there is technical power in the president to fire Mr. Mueller, it could be used as evidence of an impeachable offense. A corrupt motive to obstruct justice is what we have here. And lastly, I'd make this observation. The effort to try to denigrate, if you will, and stigmatize Mr. McCabe when he was already scheduled to resign and be out of the equation so he'd have no more involvement in the investigation within 24 hours, in my judgment, again, is some circumstantial evidence that Mr. Trump is trying to intimidate witnesses to tell them at any time you oppose me, I will use the bully pulpit to try to defame you and destroy your reputation. And that also fits into this larger pattern, if you will, because he's done the same thing to Mr. Comey, of attempting to prevent persons from being fully forthright. And lastly, with regard to the idea that the whole prosecution force has been tainted by a Democratic bias. I remind the audience that is exactly what President Richard Nixon said about Archibald Cox. He had all his Harvard people who were loyal to Ted Kennedy, Senator Ted Kennedy, and they were biased against him, and we know what the facts were with regard to Mr. Nixon. So we've heard that defense before, and it didn't pan out.
Okay, so Oliver, what do you make of that? I mean, we've got Trump's lawyer saying that McCabe's firing should prompt Mueller's firing. I mean, that is quite a leap, isn't it? And as Bruce says, if you fire Mueller, that's potentially an impeachable offence.
Well, the news stories are coming out today that he's had to walk that back. The president is not going to fire Mueller. But more importantly, the DOJ policy says that the DOJ can't put the president into a criminal tribunal while he's sitting in office. So Democrats' rhetoric to take us back generations ago to the Watergate piece and start to do extrapolations and tie to this is ridiculous. The president is not going to be impeached. This is not going to rise to that level. It is not going to be pushing into directions of criminality or any types of misdemeanors. Impeachment is a political process, and right now that's what we're in the middle of. The American people do not want this. They are saying by 3 to 4 margin that let's move on, let's get this wrapped up and closed and get back to the American people's agenda.
Let's just see whether Americans really don't want it, because you have said that 75% of Americans want the Mueller probe to end. Lara, do you agree with that? Is that the general feeling amongst the American public?
That's absolutely not true. That was a poll that was an online poll at the Drudge Report, which is a well-known conservative website. And what is important about that is a self-selected sample of individuals filling out that poll. That is not a poll of the American people in any sort of scientific sense. In fact, Pew Research, which is a credible polling organization, did find that 61% of Americans believe that Mueller will conduct a fair investigation, and that whatever his findings are will be in accordance with the law. So it is important to realize that the American people do actually back Robert Mueller in his investigation. They do believe that he is engaged in a fair investigation, and they are, in fact, quite worried about what Russia will do. That same Pew poll showed that more than 40% of the American people were skeptical that President Trump would do enough in the future to prevent Russian attacks on American elections. So I think there is a great deal of sort of rumor mongering and misinformation that is being spread by Republican partisans because they want their president to be innocent. It's not to say that their president is guilty, but it is the reality that this investigation should move forward.
Okay, but Bruce, I mean, the investigation, Mueller investigation, has been hanging over Trump for a long time now, hasn't it? I mean, it must make it awfully difficult to govern the country.
Well, it surely does, because it permits inferences to be drawn that everything you're doing has an ulterior motive to try to avoid prosecution or further investigation. But we know what the model is if you're the president and want to get an investigation concluded quickly. They were set by President Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan. President Ford was under a cloud for allegedly having sold a pardon for Nixon in exchange for his resignation. And what he did, he went right up to the House Judiciary Committee. He answered all their questions, said no, there wasn't any quid pro quo, and the whole issue went away. Immediately ended the investigation. Then we have President Reagan in Iran-Contra, and I served as counsel on the Joint Congressional Committee on Covert Arms Sales with Iran. And President Reagan said, no executive privilege, sent everybody up to testify without any obstruction, National Security Advisor, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State. He himself, Mr. Reagan, had testified in some criminal cases. It was a total open book, and it was about a year's process is what it was. And those are the standards when you have nothing to hide. Then you can look at the standard set by Richard Nixon and the stonewalling, which was the standard he used in trying to obstruct the investigation of Archibald Cox. And there are all these excuses made, no, don't testify, don't answer questions. So if Mr. Trump wants this investigation closed quickly. He needs to order all of his half dozen people who said they didn't want to answer questions to answer the questions. He needs to go to the special counsel or to the Congress and testify under oath openly and say, I have nothing to hide, and this case will come to a conclusion very rapidly. And he has good precedents. Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan.
Oliver, do you think Trump will testify?
Absolutely not. This is a Russian concussion witch hunt. This is basically nonsense. The American people want this probe to be done, but they also agree that Mueller is doing the investigation. I think your other guest who said that 6 out of 10 people want Mueller to be able to do the probe accurately. That's true, but 75% of them are saying now wrap it up. Because right now they want to get to the agenda of taxes, immigration, and infrastructure. They want to get to the Trump agenda. We hired a president to do a job. And basically, if you haven't found anything in a year after millions of dollars spent, it's time to wrap it up.
Okay, but as
because
Bruce has pointed out, one way to wrap it up is to hear directly from the president himself and for him to testify under oath.
For what? Because the key issue is that he is basically doing this job. Right now, this is a probe that's basically said that, hey, we're sad that the election turned out the way it was, and that's the way it is. Elections are winners and losers, and we need to move on. This is a Russian concussion thing. I am tired of this investigation, and I'm one American of the many. And I think that it's not a Republican partisan thing. I think the Drudge Report poll is not nonsense. It is actually tapping into what people are feeling right now. I have hundreds of thousands of followers on my own Twitter, and I'm engaging and listening to what the American people are saying. And they're saying they're tired of this Russian concussion thing. Get it over with.
Okay.
We can't basically, let me make this one point. The Democrats cannot go into 2018 as the party of no. They have to go into the party of yes, where the Republicans are. Then the party of yes right now is saying that we want low taxes, we want infrastructure, and we want immigration reform. If you go into 2018 talking about a probe that basically is going to nowhere, you're going to be the party of no. And guess what? You're going to have a lot of problems in the 2018 midterms, because 2018 midterms is about yes to America.
That does remain to be seen, doesn't it? Lara, I mean, what evidence have we got at this stage that there is or was collusion between Russia and the Trump campaign? Where is the investigation headed? When are we going to see the smoking gun?
Well, look, I think it's ridiculous to expect to see a smoking gun when an investigation is partway through. We do have plenty of circumstantial evidence that there have been wrongdoings and misdeeds and cover-up kind of activities. I mean, whether you talk about, Mike Flynn, the NSA, former NSA advisor, having to resign because he had lied about his contacts with the Russians, whether you talk about Attorney General Jeff Sessions' misstatements to the committee about his contacts with Russians, and whether you talk about Paul Manafort and Rick Gates and George Papadopoulos, their activities with respect to engaging Russians and being a part of the campaign, all of those seem to suggest that while there may not have been a conspiracy, there was certainly contact and potentially some coordinated activities that deserve further investigation and inquiry. So I think it is not unprecedented in the sense that we have had Ken Starr, who was an independent counsel who investigated President Bill Clinton for most of his presidency. That began with Whitewater, ended up with Paula Jones's lawsuit, and then Monica Lewinsky. So I don't think we can say that Trump is being unfairly targeted. We have seen these things just in the last 30 years.
Okay. Bruce, is there not the concern there that the longer the investigation goes on, the more doubt will be poured on it, undermining potentially its credibility? I mean, we've already seen the Republican House Intelligence Committee finding no evidence of collusion last week, and people pay attention to that, especially Trump supporters.
All I'd say is I don't think that's clearly accurate unless he's just running in place and not getting any new indictments. But I think if you want to get the closest to a smoking gun, it's the acknowledged June 2016 meeting set up by Donald Trump Jr. With Jared Kushner and Paul Manafort to meet with the Russians to discuss, in their own words, handing over dirt against Hillary Clinton. and then afterwards concocting this statement that no, it was all about adoptions, that the real centerpiece of Mr. Trump's campaign was worrying about adopted Russian babies, which obviously is ridiculous. Also, what we've just heard in trying to defend Mr. Trump is like Mr. Clinton saying he didn't want to testify in the Paula Jones case. The United States Supreme Court unanimously told Mr. Clinton, you need to testify. He deposed under oath, and we all saw his testimony also before the grand jury. And Mr. Clinton said, oh, I can't do my job if I have to testify. Well, the Supreme Court said you can do your job, and it went forth. There's not any reason why Mr. Trump cannot follow that model. And moreover, with regard to the absence of evidence, there are at least a half dozen suspects or witnesses who have said, we just don't want to answer questions, including Jared Kushner, including Mr. Bannon, and other key witnesses just say, well, we don't want to answer the question, even though we don't have any privilege. Well, obviously, you're going to have a slow investigation when your witnesses aren't talking.
Oliver, how do you explain away that meeting? It's a very suspicious meeting that was between high-ups in the campaign, aides to Trump, and this Russian lawyer.
It's nonsense. The key thing is that I have a video that shows Barack Obama talking to a Russian official and saying, when the election's over, I'll be much more easier in doing my policies. Is that collusion? Well, no. Leaders have a right to be able to talk with other leaders. And more importantly, at this particular case, when you're dealing with a dirty campaign that we were going through in 2016, each side is trying to get dirt on the other. No one can say that Hillary did not come out with dirt on Donald Trump when she introduced the Billy Bush tape. And that basically it's equal sides for the opposition to be able to come up with some things on other parts of the campaign against Hillary Clinton. So this is not collusion. This is not necessarily anything that was being taken place in a meeting that was very short-lived and everybody just walked away and nothing was there. We're trying to do searching for a witch hunt type of thing and search for all kinds of things. This doesn't make sense. I can't even talk about this story right now, because it's all up in the mist. It's in the noise. I'm annoyed with it. Okay. And I think the American people are too.
Okay, well, Lara, I mean, do you think, given that there is that feeling out there, do you think Mueller is going to be allowed to see this investigation through to its conclusion?
I do believe that Mueller will be allowed to see this through to its conclusion. I think the president and his attorneys realize that it would be foolish for him to make any efforts to attempt to fire the special counsel. I think that really all of this positioning and posturing and criticism over the weekend is really about trying to set the terms for the president to testify either to the special counsel in an interview with Mueller, or whether it's behind closed doors or in writing. We just don't know. But I think this was the opening salvo on an attempt to say to Mueller, you know, look, you are serving at the pleasure of the president too. Don't forget that.
Bruce, I mean, it's never a dull day in Washington. What sort of week do you think we can look forward to in the White House?
Well, it's going to be very erratic. You know, trying to predict Mr. Trump's tweets is like trying to predict, you know, the weather, you know, when it's changing every, 5 seconds. I will say this, I want to correct a misstatement earlier made. The difference between getting dirt on an opponent and this particular case in the June meeting is that it is a federal crime for a foreign government, foreigners to interfere and try to influence the outcome of election. That's not true with regard to citizens of the United States. And so I have no doubt that Hillary Clinton was trying to get dirt on Mr. Trump. But when you even solicit the assistance of a foreign citizen or a foreign entity or a foreign government, that moves from the realm of being dirty tricks into a felony. And that's what gives the jurisdiction of Mr. Mueller to investigate that particular meeting. It's just not making things up out of thin air. But I do think that one thing that we need to come away with, and that is whether or not Mr. Mueller gets fired or not. This investigation is going to continue. It can continue under the regular Department of Justice umbrella, under a new special prosecutor, but the evidence is the evidence, and firing Mr. Mueller is not going to destroy the incriminating evidence.
Okay, it will be fascinating to see it through to its conclusion, whatever which way it goes. Many thanks for all our guests for joining us today, Lara Brown, Oliver McGee, and Bruce Fein. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Lara, Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.